But then I want to dive into the best performance, our last award here. And before we get into it, Amir, I want to look at some honorable mentions. And like we talked about before, Patrick Mahomes has an argument for his Super Bowl performance. Trent McDuffie has an argument for his Super Bowl performance. Nick Bolton. There's a lot of guys you can mention here. But for a single game performance, I wanted to throw in these three guys there because Baker Mayfield in the first round of the playoffs in the wild card, where he was doubted, and even though they were home, they were the underdogs, I believe, against the Philadelphia Eagles. But for him to come out and just have the energy and play almost perfect in that wild card round, 350 total yards, 3 touchdowns, and of course got a win over the reigning NFC champion Eagles. And honestly, the score did the Eagles justice, is a good way to put it. Then you talk about Lamar Jackson. I think in his first playoff game this year against the Houston Texans, a young promising team that just blew out a division opponent for the Ravens. He came out 250 total yards, 4 touchdowns, 2 on the air and 2 on the ground. And I think it was just kind of his MVP statement game where he's like, yeah, I'm the MVP of the league this year. And then another guy is Brandon Ayuk I wanted to mention. 3 receptions, 70 yards, and that game-changing catch that you just saw on your screen against the Lions there. And that ultimately, again, changed the game, not to be cliche, against the Lions. And, of course, the Niners would have an amazing second half and win that game. Of course, Amir, there's a lot of other performances there. Amon-Ra had a double-digit catch game. Travis Kelce's had a couple of amazing games this offseason or this postseason. But any additional honorable mentions come to mind here before we get into our actual award winners?
Yeah, I mean, that game Travis Kelce had against Baltimore, I mean, 11 targets, 11 receptions, no drops. I mean, playing absolutely absurd. I think that's an honorable mention. I think, CJ Stroud's game against Cleveland,
Yes.
obviously, honorable mention that too. Personally, I think Fred Warner's game this past Super Bowl, honorable mention. I mean, he had 13 tackles. He was running sideline to sideline, making plays, anchoring that defense as well.
Yeah. But then we get into our actual winners of the award. And Amir, if you had to look at all the performances again, maybe some fandom comes into the way here for both of us, especially for me. But what do you think the best individual performance was in this postseason?
Now, I'm going to go with Puka here. I know some people might disagree, but, for Baker, I mean, the Eagles' pass defense is already bad. We kind of already expected, Baker to somewhat be able to slice them up. I mean, if Lamar's the MVP, we kind of expected that. But, I mean, Puka in his first playoff game, I mean, he single-handedly almost beat Detroit by himself. I'm sorry. I'm going to go ahead and say it. I mean, single-handedly, like when you're watching that game, you're like, dude, Puka might actually go for 200 yards and actually might carry this Lions team or carry this Rams team to the next round. And you go ahead and look at that last drive. It was an obvious holding and PI call. I mean, if they call that, Puka single-handedly, wins the Rams that game against Detroit. And I think that alone for it being his first game, for, Cooper Kupp to be fully healthy and fully back, and for him to even outperform him, I thought that was the best performance.
Yeah, I think Puka definitely. I think 9 receptions, 180 yards are both rookie records in any playoff game, let alone your first playoff game. He's been amazing. And again, he came out of nowhere. 5th-round pick out of Duke. That doesn't really scream superstar on paper.
It was Yale.
Or Yale, rather. One of those Ivy League schools, right? But then we talk about mine. And again, you had some fandom in the way. I'm going to talk about some fandom here. I'm going to give it to Jordan Love. And like I talked about there, with the fact that he was the first ever 7 seed to win a playoff game. And not only did he do that, he did it against maybe the best version of this Cowboys team we've ever seen in the Dak Prescott era. I just think to go in there in your first playoff game to shake off any other doubters that there were, to put up almost 300 total yards and have 3 touchdowns, winning that game and putting up like 50 points on arguably a top 3 defense in the NFL. It was just an amazing performance. And of course, I've been a big advocate for Jordan Love since he was at Utah State. Any additional thoughts here or any additional players you want to throw in here in this conversation?
I also, bring up, Nick Bosa, his 2 sacks against Detroit. That was huge. I mean, because if you don't get those 2 sacks in the first half, Detroit goes up by even more points and that game is out of reach. Yeah. And I think that's a really good one. Dre Greenlaw, like you mentioned, against Green Bay, well, he had 2 interceptions, right?
Yeah.
He had 2 interceptions that game.
Game-stealing one, too.
Exactly, another huge one. Nico Collins against the Browns, first round. I mean, he absolutely torched Greg Newsome, torched Martin Emerson. Was playing around with those guys as well.